Hello, hi, I'm Amy Midlin, Head of Member Engagement with Retail Excellence. Thank you all for joining us today. I can see there's still some people coming through. So look, today we have Tom Smyth and Associate coming to talk about all things HR, topical HR topics at the moment. So look, I'm going to hand you over to Tommy Smyth. Any questions, look, pop them into the inbox at the bottom there. Look, we'll get to them at the end. But I'll hand you over there to Tommy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. I think Keelan's there in the background somewhere, and he's very nicely allowed me to unmute myself and turn my video off eventually. All right, thanks, Keelan. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, topical HR webinar, but it's not going to be much fun stuff today, lads. It's, you know, an evil necessity is to maybe give you guys an introduction to legislation, law, wonderfully exciting content. But look, I hope you do understand that it's important you guys are kept up to speed maybe on changes that will definitively affect maybe your workplace now, in terms of stuff that's already in place and stuff that's going to be coming up imminently. All right. So the two pieces of legislation that I really want to focus on today are the transparent and predictable working conditions regulations, there's a mouthful, that were brought in just before Christmas. And as you may have seen in the press in the last kind of week or two, Work-Life Balance and Miscellaneous Provisions Act that is technically signed in by Michael D, but which is going to be the provisions of which are going to be brought in kind of more in installments as the year goes ahead. So just maybe, again, you know, forewarned is forearmed in terms of what's coming down the line on that. So while they're the main focus, let's not forget kind of there's just a raft of law legislation coming in that has real impact on all businesses, on retailers and every other sector at the moment. So, you know, not forgetting statutory sick pay, which is already in place since January of this year, 3 days at 70% of the day. But obviously over the next few years, that's expanding to 5, 7 and 10 days. Let's not forget that you've got pensions coming down the track as from January next year. And I suspect in the latter part of this year, all employers are going to get knocks on the door from pension providers reminding you of your responsibilities from next year. It's 1.5% is going to be added to your payroll, which is creeping up in 3-year installments up until 2033, in which stage you go from 1.5 to 3 to 4.5, and then you'll be paying 6% pensions for applicable people in another decade. Again, the minimum wage, all right. If you think that the recent increase 10.50 to 11.30 was, you know, a 1 in 5 year jump, it wasn't. You know, this government have set out that they want to move to a living wage, which is 60% of the median wage, and to get there they have to take further chunks and leaps. So you know, I've stopped using maybe the slide I've used for a year on, you know, the plane in terms of the trajectory for this. But look, it's not ridiculous to suggest that 11.30 could become 12.10 at the start of next year as the minimum wage. And again, as I've been saying to people, probably like a broken record at this stage, it's not just people who are on under 12.10, it's people who are on above it. In the same way that the 10.50 to 11.30, it's not just people who are on, you know, between 10.50 and 11.30. It's if I'm on 11.50 after 6 or 7 or 8 years of service, I'm now looking at new people coming in, untrained, no clue of what they're doing, and they're getting pretty much what I'm getting. So it's the contagion effect. So again, for your wage planning, your wage budgets, you need to start looking at that in terms of the pace of increase of minimum wages and changing. Gender pay gap reporting, anybody with more than 250 employees had to do it last year, will have to do it this year. All right. I know a lot of REI members have had to do that already, but as of next year, it's from 150 people. Anybody with more than 150 people is brought into that loop. Okay, and that reduces again in subsequent years. And we have work permit reform that's coming in, that's still in the works. Hopefully that might be a little bit better news, let's say, for employers in terms of simplifying and making the work permit market fit for purpose. Okay, so but for today, despite that mouthful, we're going to focus on maybe the top two, and ultimately there's 10 things we're going to quick fire talk about. Right, five topics or issues from the transparent and predictable working regulations, and 5 from the work-life balance. All right, and like I said, there really are an eclectic mix kind of issues. Okay, at least the sick pay, statutory sick pay legislation does what it says on the tin. The auto enrollment pensions legislation, it does what it says on the tin. These ones are kind of a little bit more of a mixed bag, as we'll see. All right. What I will say, guys, is there are some actionable takeaways. Like ultimately, what is the main actionable takeaway will be, you got to start looking at your temporary contracts and temporary handbook and just modernizing some language and changing some language and adding in a few bits and pieces. That's the takeaway, and I'll try and go into a bit more about what you should or maybe be saying, or how you might be making those changes. All right. Look, a couple of disclaimers, guys. I hope you can understand that, a half an hour here of me talking into a camera to you guys, it's not fully digesting every single legal aspect or nuance of what is legislation. Okay, I'm really translating it into as logical and constructive a message as I can. But at the same time, you want to get your proper advice. Ring the likes of us for more detailed advice, or your own providers, or whatever you would do. Okay. Certainly, I hope to be able to whet the appetite to you. Okay. So, before Christmas, the government kind of, without much of a fanfare, snuck in there a new act which affects you guys. All right, the couple of changes that I'm going to focus on that will be relevant to most of my retail clients will be changes to this concept of a 5-day statement, and then changes to the main statement, or I'm going to call it the contract. Okay, I'll try and explain those two maybe in as one in a little while, right? Then talk about probation periods. Your clause maybe on probation periods will need to be amended. Anything you have on allowing or not allowing secondary employment, parallel employment, especially your part-time workers, and any second job they might have to bolster their income. We'll have a quick chat about that, and then mandatory training and how you guys are forced to pay for it now. Okay, so we'll start with the 5-day statement into the main statement. Okay, so right, since 1994, you've had to have a written relationship with your employees. The concept of written terms of employment between an employer and employee came in, right? It's prescribed. You have to have at least, let's say 14 boxes ticked in terms of specific pieces of information. And for a long time, you had 2 months to get your act together from when a person starts and to give them these terms and conditions in writing. Now, since 2019, there's been this concept of an initial first stop. You could call it the concept of like a starter and a main course, right? That the base law from 1994 is the main course that you have 2 months to do. But then this new concept, if you wanted to use it, of a 5-day statement, which had certain key terms in there, the name of the employer, the name of the employee, wages, hours, and stuff like that would have to have been given, right? I'm going to say straight out, guys, right? Like the logical and best thing to do in reality here is, as a person starts, or even better, before a person starts, just give them a contract, get it signed, and be done with all of this kind of stuff that I'm about to talk about now. But for some people out there, if you prefer the kind of a starter letter or an initial letter of offer with certain information, right, you can still do this starter and main course concept. All right, so the 5-day statement model with the basic information, certain issues have now been added to what you have to have in this 5-day statement. So you now have to have in it any conditions relating to a probation period. You have to note the place of work. Look, the place of work, that's not a huge issue for most retail. That's possibly more an issue for other sectors where maybe people get in a van in the morning and go out to different calls. Okay, but the place of work has to be in there. Information about the title, the grade, and nature of the work, okay, has to be in there. A commencement date for it has to be in there. And any language in terms of conditions relating to hours of work and overtime, that has to be in there now as well. Okay, so look, again, if you do use this model of a 5-day statement, right, you probably have an existing template. You just now have to tick a few boxes and add a few extra clauses into this first stop starter document, as I call it. Okay. Then moving on from that, okay, to this, the main statement, or the main contract, we'll say, right? the first thing to note is whereas you would have had 2 months since 1994, the law to get this in place, you now only have 1 month. It's been brought forward. Okay. And you now have to include and list in a contract the training to be provided by the employer, obviously, if there's any. But, you know, for those of you in retail, things like manual handling, things like forklift or machinery operation, for any of you guys with food businesses, anything like food safety or HACCP and stuff like that, that would have to now be included in the contract. I'm going to mention that also in a while about how you're now on the hook for paying for that and for paying for it on your time as well. Okay, so but any mandatory training like that now has to be put into the contract. All right. In terms of hours of work as well, there needs to be better clarity that if the work pattern, so as it will be for a cohort of retail employees, your part-timers, your students, maybe some flexi workers who you have there to plug gaps. All right. If it's unpredictable, you must include the number of guaranteed hours per week. You must also include a window, let's say, of when work may be scheduled for that employee or not. Okay. And you must also include, let's say, the minimum notice of what work will be given, or what will be provided, sorry, if you're going to roster work for that people. Again, look, remember, guys, the name of this act is transparent and predictable working. All right. A lot of the logic of this comes from European directives, as a lot of our law stems from or is seeded in now. All right. And in other jurisdictions in Europe, where this law would have come from, you know, the concept of 0 hours contracts was far more prevalent. So the concept of, you know, somebody is contracted to you, but you give them 0 hours, but they have to sit by the phone waiting for your call and they can't seek any other type of employment. All right. Never really an issue in Ireland. All right. But at the same time, this is where this law is seeded from. And this is why it's brought in to kind of, you know, predominantly protect maybe people who are in more vulnerable employments, who are in lower incomes, who have no real guarantee of hours, who you know, that's who this is guided for. All right. It would also say that this one-day statement now, or this main statement now, must be in writing, okay, and it must be signed and dated on behalf of the employer. So, like, up to this point, technically, right, you know, a guy like me could have said to clients before, well, you know, at least if you emailed it to an employee, you can prove that you presented the terms and conditions to somebody. That's kind of slightly outdated advice now, in that it must actually be signed and dated by the employer. I've very often gone into WRC hearings, olden days rights commissioner hearings, tribunal hearings, you know, with a contract that just had the employee's signature on it, but never the employer's signature on it. So look, okay, and the employer must retain proof of issue. So look, really, the takeaway for this, guys, is stress test your content against the bullet points that's there. Flick in a couple of words here and there for some of your template contracts, and just make sure you have this system in place. Right? If you're a one-store retailer, when someone comes in, meet them for a couple of hours of induction, give them their uniform, introduce them to the canteen, show them around, give them their contract, give them their handbook, give them their safety statement, register them for training, right? Get it all done in the first day or two. Don't be worried. Then you can sleep easy then that if ever there's a drama down the line, you have to ring the likes of me. You know, or me and my team are drilled into us now. The first question is, well, what does the contract say? What does the policy say? So get a good habit in there. If you're a multi-site retailer, just make sure that there's good communication between your regional stores and head office on when someone starts. Make sure there's a good system of getting the contract out to a manager, and the manager does it, gets it back, sends it back to head office. Just try and have a foolproof system there that you stick to. Okay, and then there won't be an issue on it. Okay. So for years and years, again, like I'm doing this, whatever, 18 years now, and, you know, one of the go-to lines on probation was, well, it's not actually informally set out in law. Probation is just a kind of a term that an employer might contractually introduce, but it now is. Okay, so again, transparent and predictable working. Being on probation is, you know, a more precarious, unpredictable time for an employee. So that's why the likes of probation has now been included in this law. So the main change from this, really, all right, is there's two. So in normal contracts, right, just this loose ability for the employer to extend probation has now really been restricted. Okay, to the extent where, you know, the general language is, you know, there's no real extensions anymore. It's only in exceptional circumstances, all right, and where it benefits the employee. All right, so what you can do is, if a person misses a reasonable proportion of their probation period through absence or illness, we'll say, then that can be naturally extended. So you can have 6 months of assessing an employee, coaching an employee, examining an employee's work. But if it comes to you having that 6 months, it's only in exceptional circumstances that you can extend it. Now, look, I've seen some commentators out there, and you could be very employer focused on this and say, like, well, sure, if I'm at 6 months and I don't have a decision made, isn't it in the employee's benefit that I would extend it anyway? But that makes a mockery of the logic of this law if you're going to say, well, every extension is in the employee's benefit because it gives them a chance to actually earn a permanent position, right? In reality, how exactly exceptional circumstances is going to be interpreted hasn't been witnessed yet. We haven't had cases, we haven't had decisions from WRC's labour courts, right? That will come up in the wash. But ultimately, guys, while you may have to tweak your probation policies and your contracts to take out can be extended at the behest of the employer, you're going to take that out. Look, just manage your probation periods properly. Someone starts after a good solid recruitment, all right, where you think they're a good egg, good chance, bring them in, induct them properly, train them, give them every opportunity, set some reminders on your phone and your app, on a diary, you flick over the page. Oh, Tommy's here 2 months. I'm going to have a review with Tommy. Even if Tommy's wonderful, just have a review with me, have a chat with me, send me a bit of feedback, do the same after maybe 4 months, 5 months. And then, when it comes to the 6 months mark, you're not going to be taken by surprise. And you can have a grand chat with Tommy. And if he's brilliant, he's brilliant. Well done, Tommy. And if Tommy isn't brilliant, well, look, you've had 2 bites of the cherry with him already. You've given him a couple of emails with feedback, and you can look him in the eye and you can look yourself in the mirror and you can make a decision as to whether he's suitable for your team or not. Okay, so that's kind of where this probation is now, right? And one thing, guys, if for whatever reason you've missed this already and you think you have somebody in your employment who's on a 10, 11, 12-month probation period, right? They aren't, right? So if anybody was on more than 6 months of probation on the 1st of February this year, it was automatically deemed as ended, all right? Just in case any of you had been operating quite a long probation period, you may already have been caught up with this. All right. Okay, so parallel or second employment. So look, I don't think many employers out there prohibited the concept of a second job. All right. So again, is this a major change to the way this works? Probably not. All right. Some of you may have said you can't have a second job. Okay. I mean, you can still request information on any secondary job an employee might take on, and you can still intervene, right? Because it's obviously there's things like maximum working hours. If you have a full-time employee who is doing 2-3 shifts in a pub in the evening time kind of a week as well, you can certainly engage with that employee, because there's maximum hours of 48 hours average, which may be impacted on your 11-hour rest break, which may be impacted by any secondary work they do. But if you have a part-timer who's you need them for 10 or 15 hours a week, and they again work in a pub or do some shifts on the parents' farm in the summer or something like that, like it's possibly not going to be an issue, and it never has been an issue. All right. I suppose what you do need to do, and what you may have to visit any secondary employment or parallel employment clause in the likes of an employment handbook now, is just to set out more particularly your objective grounds. You might have just changed the language, that we might have an objective ground for setting out what's called an incompatibility restriction. So for if there's some pharmacy clients are on this webinar, obviously, if someone works in your pharmacy in your town, you may want to reasonably say, well, look, it's not reasonable for you to work in another pharmacy in town. It's just a conflict of interest. All right. Or if a person, is in management and is in, your supermarket, you don't want them to work for a competitor and stuff like that. If there's conflicts of interests or competition issues, all right, or going back to the likes of health and safety, someone already works 45 hours a week in your business, and then they're working, from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. bouncing on the door of a pub or something. You might think, geez, like, look, you're working too many hours. We reserve the right to get in and actually take an interest in what you do. All right. So you can insist on the disclosure of a second job just to make sure your interests and people's safety is protected. All right. But again, you certainly, if you for whatever reason have in a handbook saying, no, there's no second jobs, if you're with us, it's all the way with us and nobody else, that those days are over. You gotta look at removing that. Okay. And Yeah, and in terms of, transparent and predictable working. So this is the concept now of mandatory training. It has to be paid for by you. So the simplest ways on that are, okay, I mean, I have SafePass in there, even though it's not particularly a retail thing, just to kind of show you, like, it's mandatory. Guys can't go on building sites without a SafePass. So that's the example of, like, that has to be paid for by the employee or by employer now, and it has to be on employee. So for whatever reason, look, if you guys said to somebody who was starting with you, you go on away there and do a bit of a food safety class up there, you can get it online for 100 quid, you go and pay that kind of, and then you're able to start with us on the 15th of the month, all right? You can't do that anymore. If someone's mandatorily required to have certain training, like manual handling training or food safety or any forklift driving or whatever it may be in some of your yards or your stores, right, you have to pay for that. And also you have to pay for the time it takes for the person to do that. Okay. And again, go back to the link, what I said at the start about the contract of employment, that's going to have to be in there too, that you have to set up in the contract now what training you're going to provide. All right. So that's what's already in. Okay. I mean, obviously, guys, there's a plethora of information out there on this transparent and working conditions, right? We already did an article in the Retail Times for it recently as well, where we've pretty much set out this, obviously in black and white, without the commentary or the narrative I'm giving there now. All right, but you can find more information, or by all means, guys, you all have an account through REI with us. You can ring us for anything else that's there. All right. So this is a newer one now. This is Work-Life Balance Act, which again is in the news in the last couple of weeks. All right, and what we're going to look at, the 5 things we're going to look at under this one is finally things like remote working, albeit not a retail centric style of change, but but again, you all have certain head office people or management people or support people who may be in a different boat in terms of remote working. So we will talk about it briefly, although I won't give you the full fat kind of half an hour session on it. Probably far more relevant to you guys, as I'd like to think I've said at various webinars over the last year or two, is clarity on flexible working arrangements and requests for flexible working arrangements that are now being set out on a legal footing compared to simply between employer and employee before. Look, breastfeeding entitlements, it's one that's kind of, again, it's not going to get the headlines that that take up most of the column inches on this new law. Remote working probably is, because remote working applies to more of the workforce maybe, but like, for you guys in retail and perhaps a predominantly female workforce, and people, we'll go into it in a second now, but like, it's really, breastfeeding arrangements and breaks isn't something you've had to deal with before, all right, even though it's been in law, but it's something you're going to have to be dealing with now. And I expect quite a few requests for it. Okay, so we'll go into that. And then just 2 new kind of, shorter laws: 5 days unpaid leave to care for family, and 5 days domestic abuse leave. Okay, we're going to go into that now in these 5. Okay, so the right to request remote working. So there was last year, the plan was to bring in a dedicated act alone, which was, the right to request remote working act. All right, which again would have been one of those acts that did what it said on the tin. So instead, it got subsumed into one of these miscellaneous acts in terms of a work-life balance. And the news in that is, like, the Workplace Relations Commission are now going to, meet with employer groups. They're now going to meet with Congress of Trade Unions and other interested parties, and they're going to come up with this concept of a code of practice, setting out how employers kind of and employees would manage the requests for remote working that are going to come in. All right. So again, other aspects of this Work-Life Balance Act might come in before formally the right to commit requests for remote working. But look, in essence, what's going to happen now is all of that list there: insurance issues, safety issues, connectivity issues, and paying for employees broadbands and stuff, the cost of set up home offices, GDPR and security of data going out to people's houses if they're remote working, and obviously monitoring kind of employees and productivity, and the old wives' tales going around there about the big multinationals, and if you're away from your computer for more than 5 minutes, an alarm goes off somewhere in Boston or something. All right, like, all of these things are now going to be fleshed out and brought into a proper policy. All right, as is the fact that it's right to request remote working. It's not the right to request working from home. Now, I know a lot of the time those two may go hand in hand, but at the same time, the government are bringing in 400 apparently work hubs around the country. So, you know, if a person requests remote working, you could always check with them whether, you know, there's a hub near them, instead of having them working from their front room, and their front room all of a sudden becoming an extension of your workplace. And if they slip on a Paw Patrol toy that's left strewn around the floor, is that a workplace accident and stuff like that? All right. So look, remote working is going to be put on a proper setting. Even if you're, you know, all retail and you don't really have any support staff, you're technically still going to be producing a remote working request policy, because there could still be, you might have to send managers on a day's training, or there may be a day's paperwork once a month people are going to do, that managers could put their hand up and say, come here, could I actually do that from home instead of sitting in the office of the shop doing it? So, you know, even there could be abstract requests like that you would still perhaps put in a remote working policy anyway, right? So look, something that's probably far more relevant to you guys is the now, you know, legislated for ability for employees to request flexible working arrangements in these two circumstances. So, and this, guys, I predict, and I would hope that this is one that you guys are now waking up and smelling here and going, oh God, this is one that could affect us. Okay, so I am going to completely come up with a disclaimer to say, like, this is one of these where everything I'm reading from all legal counsels and even reading the Act, there are areas where this is still up for debate. Okay, and it may well take kind of a couple of cases, or it may well take kind of further review before there's absolute concrete kind of positions taken on, like, what certain phrases in law actually mean or they don't mean. Okay, and I'm trying for that not to sound like a fudge, but at the same time, it probably just is, because with any new law, you're often waiting for, well, what did the government mean in the legislation when they say blah blah blah. All right, so flexible working arrangements can be requested in two different scenarios, right? For simple care purposes, in the case of a child under 12, or again, if a child has a disability or there's a long-term illness, maybe there it's 16, all right? And also for maybe personal care or support for medical care purposes for maybe wider family members. So there's a prescribed list of that, you know, it's siblings, obviously children, parents, grandparents, or someone else who resides in the family home, all right? So what are they ultimately going to be requesting? They're going to be putting in a proposal for you for possibly earlier starts, later starts, earlier finishes, later finishes, reduced hours, and okay, again, not predominantly retail, but in the wider scale of things, remote work. So they're looking for a package of changes that would ultimately constitute flexible working arrangements. So before an employee can make such a request, they have to have 6 months service with the employer. The request has to be made in writing, and it has to be made in writing at least 8 weeks before the employee wishes to commence it. And then it goes to the employer. You then have to consider the request the employee's made, having regards, you know, as I'm regurgitating pretty much what it says in the law, for, you know, both your own needs as employers, but also the needs of the employee. And you have to respond within 4 weeks. And in certain circumstances, you can extend that by, you know, if there's certain pinch points that people make a request, maybe perhaps, and I'm just saying this thinking out loud, you know, middle or end of November, and it's very difficult for you to have any clarity on things until Christmas, the mad Christmas retail season is over. You could possibly seek the likes of an extension, or if someone's going on holidays, decision maker, etc. All right. If you can agree to the flexible working arrangements, you'd set it out in an agreement, because you might be temporarily changing the core underlying position of the contract of employment. So you would set out that for the summer, you know, for childcare reasons, you know, Billy or Mary can work, you know, their hours in 3 10-hour shifts rather than, you know, 5 7-hour shifts, or whatever it may be. All right. So at the moment, what's the stick behind it is probably what everyone is currently asking in their heads here. Like, you know what I mean? All right. So like at the moment, the WRC, a case can be taken to the WRC by an employee, but it's only around specific aspects of it. Generally, if you don't get back to an employee, all right, they can look at it. And if you kind of technically don't follow the law and follow the principles of the law, an award up to 20 weeks pay can be made. But again, that's not if you don't grant it. All right, the WRC can't simply compel you to grant every request an employee is made. So look, what I would say, guys, is, right, There's a grey area to this, I get there is, but ultimately if an employee is allowed to make the request, you should look at the request, right? Take the time, don't be lazy, don't be presumptuous, I'll go on away, I couldn't be arsed, right? Have a look at the request, have a look at the roster. If you can credibly accommodate it, try to accommodate it. If you can't, you go back to the employee and you give the specific reasons why you can't do it. And if you do that, while the employee may never agree with you, at least you're following the law and you're respecting the employee's wish and ability to make the request in the first instance. Okay, so breastfeeding then. So at the moment, you know, there is rights for a new mother with regards to breastfeeding, but it's only until the child is 6 months old, which, look, if you think about it, most women don't return at the earliest from maternity leave until, if there's 26 weeks basic maternity leave, 2 weeks before the child is born, 24 after, the child is pretty much 6 months old when the person returns to the workplace anyway. So really, the significance of what's already been there in breastfeeding in legislation regarding breastfeeding has really negligible impact. Okay, that's now been extended up to the child being 2 years of age, right? So, what does it mean? It means that a mother who's breastfeeding is entitled to paid breaks or paid reduction of hours in order to facilitate her breastfeeding her child. And so in the form of one, now this is based on a full day, let's say 60-minute break, 2 30-minute breaks, or 3 20-minute breaks. All right. Now, and again, look, a lot of that depends on logistics. It depends on if there's a childminder, does the employee live close to the place of work? Is the child in creche close to the place of work? All right. Could they go home for one long break or not? Okay, so there's a couple. It'll be all circumstances dependent. These ones, all right. Do you have a room or a room in your premises which you could have in quite a reasonably hygienic state and have a fridge in there where a mother could either have the child brought into her to feed the child or could use the facilities there to express and store a pump and then store milk afterwards in the likes of a fridge. All right. So again, perhaps you can see what I mean now for the likes of, you know, retail. Something like this could be one of these sections of this act, which may actually have a bigger impact than the likes of even remote working. All right. Whereas the remote working will get all the headlines in the press. All right. So look, it's something you're going to have to start thinking about. One of the first things I'd consider is there, you know, obviously you have to have locked facilities if an employee is going to breastfeed or express. Okay, you can't have it generally in the canteen. It's a separate maybe area there, right? But where could you clear somewhere out, get somewhere kind of made up, or if there's more than a negligible cost, you don't have to have a place on site, but then you have to be reasonable with the employee time to go off site, maybe to express or to feed their child. All right. And then look, the last 2 sections of this are medical care leave and domestic violence leave. Okay, so there's now 5 days. Employees have 5 days in any 12-month period where if there are close relations who need, and these are the phrases now, and I'm going to say kind of inverted commas, we need to wash through a bit, significant care or support or for a serious medical purpose. All right. So that can be 5 days. It is unpaid leave, this leave. Okay. But again, it's a person won't be turning up for work and will be saying, I need to take one of these, one of my 5 days, medical care leave days, because I have a relation who fits into significant care or support or a serious medical purpose. Okay. So this could be as simple as someone who's quite ill or needs to be brought to a hospital appointment or something like that. It would also say you can ask for reasonable evidence to firstly show that it is a close relation that you need to care for. I've seen some commentators say you could possibly go so far as to ask for a medical cert in relation to this other person. I grimace when I hear that in terms of, you know, GDPR, and are you going to ask an employee to give their Uncle Henry's medical cert, you know, when you're bringing him up for an oncology appointment to Dublin, perhaps. All right. You just need to be careful to ask for that. So look, there's 5 days there. Look, one thing I will say is that all employees get that. So one thing to note is if ever you have one employee, possibly, you know, a female employee who takes these days for kids, well, obviously remember the father also has these 5 days as well. So, just, that if one parent is using up these days for a particular reason, remember, like if it's to bring a mother somewhere, well, then if they have siblings, their siblings also have these 5 days from their employment as well. Just one thing to note if somebody ends up using these 5 days quite quickly. All right. And look, there's also domestic violence leave as well. That there will be 5 days. It will be paid leave. The exact rate of pay, I don't have an answer for right now. It's going to be set by a ministerial order in due course. Okay. And this can be claimed retrospectively. So if someone doesn't attend work for a day or two, they can come back afterwards and say, look, that was actually domestic violence leave and the time was taken. I needed to, again, perhaps seek medical treatment. I had to seek legal advice. And, again, in these situations, guys, obviously confidentiality and sensitivity is very important. You'd want to have maybe a reporting structure as and again, possibly this is where your changes to your terms and conditions will come in here, that in the event that someone wishes to claim the likes of this leave, who do they contact? You maybe don't want a scenario where they'd say to their supervisor in store, who then say to the manager, who then ring head office, who then would tell HR. Things like this needs to be pretty much a direct line of communication to the right person who can keep it sensitive and make a decision as to whether to approve payment or not for it. Okay. So look, again, there you go. Like they're the changes that are there in the law at the moment. All right. And in reality, like in terms of a summary of where what you have to do now, what you have to look. I mean, definitely the contract, guys. Okay. There are things there, both in go back to the 5-day statement slide and the general terms of employment slide, in terms of the variable hours, the window that hours might work, your probation period, changes to that, your secondary employment, and making sure your language is right in terms of objective justifications and conflicts of interest is there. Okay, remote working applications. You don't necessarily have to work on your remote working policy, but you have to start having it in mind now. And you have to start thinking that even for your head office team or a finance team or a HR team or marketing team, all right, like, how are you going to deal with them bringing information home? And, do you have work hubs you might start using instead in their towns or their villages where they would be living? You don't have to produce the policy yet, but you can certainly start thinking about it because, it's coming. All right. We've discussed breastfeeding and possibly are there locations in your places of work where you can facilitate that? If not, again, you're going to have to start looking at kind of enhanced breaks. And this again, this comes back to a big impact. I mean, if you have somebody works a 40-hour week, they could, in essence, for a year and a half, be asking you for 5 paid hours off a week to facilitate feeding their child. All right. Or for part-timers, 20 minutes, half an hour here and there. Either they start getting paid at 9:30, but they don't come in until 10, and they take that time as right. And obviously you have all these new forms of leave as well, like your domestic abuse leave, your unpaid leave for caring purposes, and your requests for flexible. So there's plenty of changes to terms and conditions that have to be made. That's the main takeaway from it. Okay, and I suppose secondly, on other aspects of it, is it's watch this space as things develop, as customs and practices develop. What I will say, guys, is, REI and ourselves, we've had a good partnership for since 2007. So we've already contacted the WRC and we've asked the WRC to come in to us. They're coming in on the 25th to REI offices. We're going to attend, and some of the HR directors from some of the bigger members are going to attend as well. And we're going to be trying to find out information in some of the areas where you're going to say, oh my God, Tommy's left that grey there. I'm not resting on my laurels, and I'm not happy to give you guys grey advice. I tend not to be. So we're doing our best to get more information from the WRC. The chap who's coming in is both an adjudication officer and he's a career public servant as well. So he'll have an idea what's happening in inspections. We'll do a member update afterwards on any more clarity we have on the grey areas.
Tommy, thank you so much. Gosh, so much information to take away. I've been writing away Godot.
Mushy information.
There's a couple of questions just come in there, Tommy, if we could just run through them quickly. So, hi, Tommy, we need to send an amendment of contract to our current employees to include these new provisions.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I mean, okay. Like some of them are handbook changes. Okay, so the majority like secondary employment, probation, all right, like it's included in as terms of employment, but you might be able to include them more in the likes of an employment. Okay. Sorry, the likes of a handbook, okay, which many people would update annually anyway. They do a 2023 handbook, 2024 handbook, right? But yeah, I mean, some of the ones that are more particular in terms of hours and windows of work, then yes is the answer. You know, it's worthwhile doing a little, I mean, it doesn't have to be a new contract. You could send a letter to certain employees saying, look, guys, new laws come in. Look, just to give you a snapshot, here's the window of hours that we could possibly roster you from. You know, you might have an agreement with Billy that Billy never works Thursdays and Fridays, but you can say, look, Billy, you'll get your hours, you get a minimum guaranteed 10 hours a week, and it will be from, you know, Monday morning at 8 until Wednesday at 7. That's the agreement with you. So yes is the answer, but I'm saying that in terms of, you know, how exactly you structure it or give it to me. You don't necessarily have to give a brand new contract to everybody and freak them out. You can do it in terms of a letter communicated to them of updated norms.
Great. Just another question. Second employment. So what about colleagues with work restrictions, and they're kind of given the example of a stamp 2?
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I mean, if certain colleagues, if their work permits restrict their work practices, all right, then in terms of maximum working hours and the likes of that, well, then this law wouldn't change anything in relation to that. All right. I suppose like get my thoughts on that one now. Right. So like the secondary, well, right, nothing's really changed in terms of that from what my understanding of it is. All right. So if you have the conditions on a stamp 2 haven't changed, it's really about the terms and conditions that you have directly with your own employees. Right. So the employee's ability to get a second job, no, nothing would have changed in terms of anything that's changed in this law relating to work permits. No, is the answer. All right. I might have a think about that one. I might come back to that one and have a quick double check to see, because what I'm thinking about here is how any changes for the work permits that's coming in later in the year might impact and whether they've linked it in any way. All right. So sorry, complete fudge on that one, but leave it with me, and if I can offer any clarity. I can see Michelle's asked that, so I can go back to Michelle on it if anything.
Great. Okay. So then if someone works their 8 hours, is the extra hour on top of their 1 hour lunch break? So they get 2 hours break instead of 1 each day?
Yes, basically. So if we're talking about breastfeeding arrangements now, if they make that application, it is okay. So their 1 hour lunch break, which again in itself is something we're possibly going to talk to the WRC about, because the 1 hour lunch break in retail is in certain circumstances is a unique thing to retail, but yes is the short answer on that. All right, the breastfeeding arrangements are a completely separate break. A person isn't on their lunch when they're breastfeeding their child or when they're expressing their child. It's a separate break, right? And it is a paid one. And again, if depending on the shift pattern of the person, like I said, this could be 5 hours a week that an employee gets off for a year and a half.
Okay, perfect. And then just finally, domestic violence, is that reflective of physical or can it be mental stress as well?
I'd say it can be, I don't know, in black and white is the honest answer on it. But I think possibly domestic violence has moved beyond just bruises and broken arms. All right. And you know, like coercive control and such behaviors as well would fall into the category of domestic violence, as would sexual violence. Okay, so I would have thought that it can basically, you know, and look what it will be. This is one where I would say, guys, it's important that, you know, when we do updates to terms and conditions, you know, that we make sure that if a person is ever requesting this domestic violence leave, they just go to the right contact person in, you know, to the HR manager or to the business owner in confidence, so they, you know, that the person who they are coming to request this leave knows exactly what they can or can't ask or should or shouldn't ask, and knows exactly how to support the person making the request.
Perfect. Okay, great. Tommy, look, that's everything. Thank you so much for your time. Again, so insightful. Really appreciate your continued support, and to all our members. And look, we look forward to seeing you on the 25th. And thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks very much, guys. Take care.
Bye.